All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Good day. My name is Ramy and Pierre. I'm the Chief Learning Officer for Break the Norm Leadership, and today's Lunch and Learn is about imposter syndrome. We're going to be talking, I'll probably talk for about 25 minutes, and then I'll leave time at the end for questions. If you do have a question, you just don't want to make sure you get it out of your head before you lose it, feel free to drop it in the chat. I probably won't be paying too close attention to the chat because I don't have a producer today until the very end when I'm doing Q&A. But that said, let me say this. Imposter syndrome is one of my favorite, but also nerve-wracking topics to talk about from personal experience and also from professional experience. It's more commonly in the research or academic field known as imposter phenomenon. But today I'll be using those terms interchangeably. I'm talking about the same thing. Now, if you were to Google imposter syndrome or imposter syndrome remedies or how to manage imposter syndrome, you're going to see thousands of entries. And it gives the impression that we as human beings know a whole lot about imposter syndrome. But I went back and looked at the research and I found out a couple of things. I found out that we don't know much for sure about imposter syndrome, that much of what we know is based on anecdotal evidence where somebody talked to somebody else, got some stories, and turned those stories into data around which they developed programs or developed science or recommendations. Now, I'm going to admit, I'm going to kind of do the same sort of thing today. I'll be sharing three distinct stories from my life about imposter syndrome. All of them have a point, and I'll be telling you what the point is. And at the end, I'll be giving you some general advice about imposter syndrome. But at least what I've done is I've gone and looked at the empirical research around imposter syndrome to see what is really out there. What do we really know? So one, I can tell you we don't know much. Two, I can tell you most of what we know about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon is how it's experienced by um, white women in their young 20s. And that's simply because the psychologists, researchers who were exploring imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, they researched people who they had at hand, their students. So we know more about how imposter phenomenon shows up in white women in their young 20s than we do about any other group. Also not surprising because the researcher who coined the term imposter syndrome, Dr. Clance, she did this in 1978. Like she started her research exploring explicitly white women. All right, so we don't know much. Much of what we know is about a very small population. So actually, at Break the Norm Leadership, we're looking to collect more data around imposter syndrome because I predict that a lot of people are misdiagnosing themselves, that they're actually experiencing very real feelings, but don't qualify as imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. So I'm going to talk about that today by sharing three different stories about my life. I hope you'll indulge me because each one does have a point. Um, and the first story, they're all baked around one of these terms that I think you've heard before, like fake it until you make it. I'm assuming that's pretty popular among most folks that you've heard it before. And I want to tell you my fake it until you make it story. Picture it. It's 2001 in Washington, D.C. I'm a 29-year-old graduate student, and I'm just finishing up a research project, pardon, a consulting project at the Duke Ellington School of the Arts. I was basically a research assistant for one of my professors. We're sitting in a classroom at those desks with the weird arm that makes you feel like you're 12 again and you really hate it. And we're waiting for a meeting to start. And in that 5 or so minutes when we're all there, but waiting for this one last person to get there, the gentleman next to me, he turns to me and says, well, your project's about to wrap up. You're going to be finished. You're going to head back up to, I was going to graduate school in Cambridge at the time. So you're going to head back up to Massachusetts shortly. What do you want to do with your life when this project is over? Now, this is a question that I got a lot growing up. It's that what do you want to be when you grow up question. But experiencing it as a graduate student, I suddenly had this incredible anxiety. I thought I should know what the answer to this question is. I'm a doctoral student, pardon. I should be able to have a very cogent answer. I did not have one, so what I decided to do was lie. And so I said, I want to be the principal of a performing arts high school. I figured that's literally where I am. That's going to be an acceptable answer. He'll be happy, move on, and we can get this meeting started. Uh, what I didn't know, there were a couple things I didn't know. First, I didn't know who this person was. It turned out he was Derek Gordon, who at the time was vice president of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Number two, I didn't know that he knew me. I've been working on this consulting project for 2 years. As an assistant, he had been following my work for that entire 2 years. So he knew what I was producing. He saw my written work. He saw my work product, right? Um, and third, I didn't know that he was hoping that I was the answer to his problem. So here's what Derek said. He said, so Ramian, have you heard of the Villar Arts Management Fellowship Program at the Kennedy Center? And I said, no. He thought I meant I never heard of the Villar Fellowship Program in Arts Management. But what I meant to say was, I've never heard of the Villar Arts Management Fellowship. I never heard of the Kennedy Center. I have no idea what you're talking about. But I was really good at that point in my life of faking it. I could just fake a conversation. I usually would keep as quiet as possible until the other person gave me some data and then move on that. Um, the next thing Derek asked me, well, he told me, he said, well, the fellowship program is starting this fall. We're looking for 12 fellows for the program. We want 6 of them to be international and 6 from the United States. We have 6 international fellows. We have 5 US fellows. And I was looking for one more fellow, and I would like it to be one of us, if you know what I mean. To which I responded, yes, absolutely. Also, I had no idea what he was talking about. But again, I was faking it. I thought for a moment, well, Derek appeared to me to look Hispanic. It turns out he was Creole, he's from Louisiana. So I thought, I'm black, he's Hispanic. It can't be a race thing. I thought, does he know that I'm queer? Is it a queer thing? Like, what is going on here? So I said, yes, I know exactly what you mean. The conversation continues, and Derek says, well, I want one of us to be one of the 6 fellow. Is that something that you would consider? And fast forward for about like 3 more minutes of me going back and forth of, is this man really offering me a fellowship without like knowing who I am, seeing any of my work, like sight unseen, although none of those things were true. It turned out he was. I ended the conversation when the person came in, the meeting started by saying yes. Or no, I didn't say yes. I said, I need some time to think about it. And immediately after the meeting, my boss, who he clearly had talked to ahead of time, came up to me and said, what did he say to you? I explained what happened. She said, what are you going to do? And I said, would it be crazy for me to say yes? And she said something I thought was
Good
brilliant. She said,
morning,
good morning.
Blackthorn. Yeah.
Great. I'm in the middle of a story. I'm going to put you on mute. Is that okay?
Hi.
All right. So I said, would it be crazy for me to be considering saying yes? At which point she said, yes, it would be crazy, and you should do it. So long story short, I did it. It was a huge change in my life from classroom teaching to working more with adults, and it was fantastic. So for me, the key takeaway, and I think this is a valuable piece about imposter syndrome, is it wasn't me being a fake person. In that moment, what it was a way for me to manage my anxiety around, I don't know what's going on here. Now, the research I've seen also shows that when people don't know what's going on, they tend to make assumptions, they tend to rely on biases to fill the gaps in between what they think they know and what is happening. And for me, faking it was that way of getting more data. So it actually was a useful tool, although in hindsight, I did lie to this man in sort of some pretty embarrassing ways. But the bottom line, the moral of that one story around imposter syndrome and being fake is that it's a useful tool when you are uncertain, particularly for me in a time when I thought I should be really certain. I should know the answer to the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? All right, so that's my fake it until you make it story. I've got 2 more, and then I'm going to have some advice for you. So fake it till you make it. Then comes fake it until you become it. Um, and for this one, I learned that phrase from Dr. Ann Cuddy. She had a TED, not had, she has a TED talk about the power. about power posing, and which is awesome. I recommend looking it up, spending some time with it. But what I really love about her talk is the first few minutes before she gets into the power posing piece, she talks about how she experienced imposter syndrome as a professor at Harvard University. She felt like she was faking it until she made it, and then she realized, no, I'm actually faking it until I become it. So here's my fake it until I become it story. Picture it, it's 1993, and I'm in Oakland, California, where I'm a middle school history teacher. So I'm 23 years old. This is my first real adult the important thing to know about me is that I grew up an introvert with stranger danger and not a whole lot in terms of people skills. So my mother said this as she was driving me to the airport. What in the world possessed you to teach other people's children? Like, you don't, you barely like people. You definitely don't like children. Why are you doing this? Um, it was the bad time to have that conversation as I'm about to board this plane to take me across the country for this job. But I took the job, and what I thought through in the few days before school started, before orientation started, is I said, she's a little bit right. And I need to come up with a strategy for how I'm going to manage this. How can I be successful at my job? How can I help these kids and do good work when Ramian is a hot mess who does not do people well? Um, so I decided I would lean into Mr. Pierre as something that was distinct and different from Ramian. So we have Ramian, stranger danger, introvert, not good with people. And then we have Mr. Pierre. And I basically made up Mr. Pierre, like what kind of teacher would I want to be? What kind of teacher would I want to have? So Mr. Pierre was informed, he was smart, he was observant, he was funny, he was approachable, he was tall, like all the things that I really wanted to be. And what I found is that by playing Mr. Pierre 50 minutes at a stretch, 5 to 7 times a day, depending on what my class schedule was that day, I actually shrank the distance between Ramian and Mr. Pierre. And I wasn't the one who noticed it. Um, After my first year of teaching, I kept that job for 2 years. The summer after that first year, I went back, came back to the East Coast, and I visited my grad school where I learned how to teach. And I visited with my supervising professor. This is the professor who interviewed me to get me into the program, who supervised my work to make sure that it was up to snuff. Like I just thought this guy is incredibly smart, incredibly observant. I actually stole pieces of his personality for my Mr. Pierre persona. And he said something to me that I still haven't forgotten. He said, and he prefaced it with this, I don't want to offend you, so hopefully what I'm about to say is not offensive, Ramian. But it seems to me like just that 1 year of teaching that you have under your belt has helped you connect with a really sweet part of yourself. Now, having a grown professor tell me I thought I was a 24 grown man, that I was sweeter now than I was before when he met me during grad school, like for a second seemed slightly offensive. And then I realized, I am a sweet person. Deep down inside, I was a sweet kid. I just learned to be stereotypical masculine, or I learned to put up my guards and my barriers. But at my heart, I am a sweet person. And he's right. Being Mr. Pierre and playing at him for however long a school year is, 180 days or so, really has helped me get more in touch with my authentic self. So I think the moral there is being Mr. Pierre wasn't me being fake. Being Mr. Pierre, it actually was two things. It was me creating a goal, like here's the best version of me, and I want to strive to be that best version of me multiple times a day, 5 days a week for 9 months in a row. So it was a goal. It was also a container. It was like this space, like a 50-minute container at a time where Ramian could play at and practice being the kind of person that Ramian really wanted to be on a more consistent basis. So, for all of you thinking about imposter syndrome as fake being bad, consider this that when you are behaving like an imposter, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because I'll talk more about that after my next story, you being an imposter could actually be a way for you creating a container where you can actually protect yourself while you're developing to be a better version of yourself or a better fit version of yourself for the environment that you're in. So that's my fake it until you become it story. That me faking at being Mr. Pierre helped me actually become a better Ramian and a better Mr. Pierre. Now, for my third and final story, I want to talk about fake it until you learn it. And this is a more recent evolution I have on this fake it till you become it um, paradigm or common phrase. And let me set the scene for you. It's 2014 in Chicago, Illinois. And so I'm 44 years old. And I am running for International Mr. Leather because I'm a complicated person with so many layers upon layers. Now, remember, I'm still that introvert, stranger danger, um, hard difficulties managing people. And I'm basically competing in a leather pageant where if I win, I will be an ambassador traveling around the country and the world, speaking to the leather folk in whatever way I deem appropriate. And I ended up winning. Spoiler, not spoiler alert. It's history now. And I felt a lot of pressure. I was only the third Black man to ever win the title in more than 30 some years. And so I was feeling a lot of eyes on me. And a lot of IML's International Mr. Leathers before me had platforms and they were working for charities or they were educators who were promoting a certain approach around like safe consensual kink or whatnot. I had none of that. I had no idea what kind of IML I wanted to be, what kind of leather person I wanted to be. I was just basically for that first, let's say 5, 6 months, trying to figure out how can I survive public events and not crawl into a ball in a corner. Of my 52-week title year, I traveled 26 weekends to different events in this country, Africa, and Europe. So it was exhausting for a latchkey kid like me. But here's what I found out really early on is that I have a way of unlocking my superpowers. And back then, the way I unlocked them was if I had a double espresso and a double shot of tequila, I was the warmest, kindest, like sharpest, most personable person for 90 minutes. And so during my title year, I drank a lot of espresso and a lot of tequila to get through my title events. It was like the espresso gave me strength and the tequila gave me warmth, and that combination just made me a great politician, essentially. So there's no official job to being IML. You can do whatever you want. And there's actually a joke among the leather pageant folks that even I think it's even yeared IMLs are pretty and odd numbered IMLs who win during odd number years are crazy. So at least I lucked out that I was on the pretty track, but I couldn't just stick with being pretty. So I would go to these events and I'd spend a lot of time. I said, you know what? I'm going to be the nicest IML ever. So I was just friendly with everyone. Again, powered by tequila and espresso. I was friendly. I was kind. I would talk to people. I used the platform as a chance to put microphones in people's faces as opposed to a megaphone where I had some sort of agenda to announce. And here's what I found again. Well, one, very close to the end of my title year, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "You know, Raymond, I know what your job is. You are a good example of being a good example. That's what you've been doing all year." And I thought that is a really great way of looking at it, and I'm going to own that. Being nice, particularly a nice pageant winner, particularly a nice leather pageant winner, um, I I appreciate and I receive being a good example of being a good example. But more importantly, I think again, this example of me being a fake IML until I figured out what kind of IML I wanted to be is an example of how faking it, of how feeling like an imposter is actually a container for you to grow and explore and figure yourself out. So again, not a bad thing. It actually could be a good thing. Now, let me give you some advice, and this is based on my experience as well as my read of the research. But I'll make one warning is though this is my advice, I don't yet have all of the data to prove it. My plan is over the next year or so to recruit enough people into imposter syndrome studies that actually can get real data to see if my advice holds up. So maybe I shouldn't call this advice so much as hypotheses of what I think is really going on when people talk or say that they're feeling like an imposter or a fake. So the first thing I'll say is your feelings around imposter-ness are real, but they may not be imposter phenomenon. Um, Often what I found for myself and in talking with others, imposter feelings could fall into one of two categories. Most of what they say falls into one of two categories. Category one is poor environment fit. What that means is I am in a place or a situation or an environment that isn't designed for me or for people like me. And what I'm doing is I'm comparing myself, my real self, to some sort of standard or example of a person who should be in the situation that may not even exist. Um, if any of you were around in the 1980s, this discussion was happening a lot at US colleges around diversity, where 100-year-old colleges, 200-year-old colleges were suddenly realizing, how can we stay this 200-year-old institution that was designed for land-owning, upper class white men and make our place acceptable for people who aren't upper class land-owning white men, which is the rest of us, most of us. So how can we stay, for example, how can Harvard stay Harvard while still being broader to a larger community? Um, because what was happening is students were coming in and feeling like imposters, not just at Harvard, but at lots of colleges, feeling like imposters because the environment wasn't designed for them. It wasn't them, it was the environment. One of my favorite poems is it's called Spiritual Chickens. It's a poem by the Irish poet Stephen Dobbins. And in the poem, the main character sees something which is impossible. And the poem goes something like, given the choice of something odd with the world or broken with his head, he went with the broken head. That's imposter syndrome. That if the world is odd, you're in an environment that wasn't designed for you, but somehow you or the environment convince you that you're the problem, not the environment. So poor environment fit is what I believe would explain a lot of these imposter syndrome feelings. The second bucket that I feel explains my experience and the experiences of a lot of people I've talked to is the learning doing tension. And this idea was introduced to me probably in the last 4 or 5 years. It's the idea that we feel as human beings, we tend to feel uncomfortable or dissatisfied or wrong when we're learning something at the same time as we're doing that thing. Imagine you're new at a job, and in case I hope I'm not breaking this news to you, but when you start a job that's new to you, you have two things to do. You have to do your job and you have to learn how to do your job. And sometimes that can feel really awkward, but doesn't mean that you're an imposter. And what I've been finding and experiencing is that many people think or assume that that feeling, that tension between I'm learning how to do this while I'm doing it, but I still have a lot to learn, so I don't feel like I'm doing it to a good enough standard. Again, comparing yourself to a standard, that tension feels like I'm being an imposter. But that's learning. Like that's the way learning works. You gotta like there's some uncomfortableness experiencing. You experience some uncomfortableness when you're learning. More importantly, there are some grown adults who have very successful and profitable careers living with that tension every day and managing it. And I think of consultants. Consultants come into organizations or come into projects. They're not the expert on what's going on in that environment, but they have to perform pretty quickly. So they have learned to learn while doing. And I believe if consultants can do it, then we all should be able to do it to some degree. So those two buckets, I think, explain a lot of imposter syndrome feelings that people have. And so my advice is let's not assume that you have imposter syndrome. You might have something else that has nothing to do with you, but has to do with either the environment or your job of learning while doing. Now, let's say you actually do have imposter syndrome. You're having these feelings like you are not enough. You're a bad person. You're insufficient. You're deficient. My suggestion or advice there is do your best to disassociate yourself from those thoughts. I'm not saying cancel the thoughts. They're not going to go away. My therapist is fond of reminding me that I can't control the thoughts that come into my head, but what I can do is not feed the thoughts that don't help me. So when I say disassociate, what I literally mean is separate yourself, your identity from this thought just make a little space in there. So recognize that you don't have to be your thoughts. Everything that pops into your head is not always true about you. Find some way to disassociate your feelings from your thoughts. And for me, and for many others, a way to do that is to somehow externalize what I'm feeling. Many people who experience or talk about experiencing imposter syndrome also talk about how they're so embarrassed about the feeling that they keep it to themselves. What I have found is that if you can express the feeling and to maybe to a third party, maybe write it out. Even I've seen people talk about if you can talk about yourself having those feelings in the third person, all of those things have this unique quality where they instead of the feeling having you, you have it. By putting it out there, it's you have a little more objectivity around it and a little more space from it. It actually helps you separate the thought and the feeling from you and your identity. So, advice part number one, recognize that you might not be having imposter syndrome. You could have other things going on. Advice number two, that when in doubt, separate your feelings from your identity. And then the last piece of advice that I'll give is when all else fails, when you feel alone, without hope, without an ability to manage these feelings, I want you to remember this one thing. Espresso and tequila are always the answer. They are not the right answer, but they're definitely an answer that you have available. All right. I went a little bit longer than I expected. If you have to drop, I completely understand and will not be offended. But what I would like to do is to stay on to see if there are questions that I might be able to answer. If you want to drop a question into chat, or if you want to take yourself off mute, I'm more than happy to answer questions for 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you for the hand clap, Laura. I appreciate that. I
Oof,
did get a,
oof.
oh, someone's taking
Sorry.
themselves off mute. Please.
Sorry, I did. It's Maggie, by the way, not M.
Maggie.
Um, I don't have a question, I have a comment. And that is that, and maybe it was poor environment fit, but I'm not sure that's exactly it. I stayed with the same organization for 22 years. And I started out as an analyst and left as a vice president. And every day in that organization, I knew I was going to get fired because they would figure out that I didn't belong there. Let me also say that I never asked for a promotion or applied for a promotion in that organization without being told to apply for the promotion or having the position built for me and told then go apply for it. So all those things were there saying you're doing great. And sorry, I am a white woman, but I'm not in my 20s and I didn't start there in my 20s. But I left that position after 22 years, really bad boss, had to go. I'm in the same role in a much smaller organization and no longer have those feelings. I don't know whether it's intense anxiety and insecurity coupled with poor environment fit, but I can tell you, having lived it, it is an incredibly hard place to be. And I stayed there for a long time in that hard place.
Ah, well, my heart goes out to you, Maggie, and thank you for
Please
sharing that.
don't. No, I'm great.
It sounds like you're much better now, but and you're right because how hard it can be. We actually become complicit in like keeping this dynamic going because
Mhm.
feelings and emotions are tricky, right? Feelings are actual like physical sensations, whereas the emotions are the labels we put on them. And so once you label it imposter feeling, like someone's gonna tap me on my shoulder and say, Maggie, today's the day. We finally figured you out. Nice try, but after 15 years, you're out of here. We finally caught you. But once we start labeling it imposter syndrome, it ends up being confirmation bias. We see it everywhere, and we use it to explain our failures and our successes. What Dr. Clance found in her research is that people who labeled or feel imposter syndrome, even when they are successful, they'll either say it's because of luck. I got lucky this time, just like last time, the time before that, the time before that, the time before that. Like we can talk ourselves into believing we have 22 years of luck, even though we never won the lottery. Or what people experiencing imposter syndrome will do is they'll over prepare. And so they'll talk when they if they succeed, they'll say, well, the only reason why I succeed isn't because I'm smart enough or good enough. It's because I put in so much time and effort. That's what explains it. And maybe I got a little bit lucky. Like we end up talking ourselves into believing the story that we somehow bought in from the environment. At least that's my theory. And I really appreciate you saying out loud what I feel like a lot of people experience, and I certainly have. Thank you. Um, there are at least a couple people in the chat who asked about, am I recruiting participants for the study? Email Rachel so we have your contact information. My plan is actually to design the study over the next month or two and then start recruiting volunteers to be willing to help us collect data from non-20-year-olds. Like I don't care if they're white women or like black men, but we need data from mid-career, senior career professionals in not-for-profit, for-profit academic environments, and government environments as well. And I would love to collect some of that data. So if you're interested, please contact Rachel at breakthenormleadership.com. If you also go to breakthenormleadership.com, you'll see our schedule for Lunch and Learns going through the end of the year. Our next Lunch and Learn is on inclusive leadership. It's on October 15th, the Ides of October. All right, I'm going to stop recording and I will stay on for a few more minutes, but please feel free to please